Out of approximately 10,000 people aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff on the night of January 30th, 1945, only 1,252 survived. More than 9,000 died in the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. 6 times more deadly than the Titanic, yet most people have never heard its name. The ship carried 5,000 children, thousands of refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army, and roughly 1,000 German naval personnel. When Soviet submarine S-13 fired 3 torpedoes into its hull, Captain Alexander Marinesko killed more people in 70 minutes than died in most single battles of the entire war. This is the story of a man seeking redemption, a ship full of civilians, and a decision made in darkness that still raises questions about where military necessity ends and moral catastrophe begins. Alexander Marinesko was facing disgrace when he spotted the Wilhelm Gustloff through his periscope. The 32-year-old submarine commander had been drunk for most of December 1944, absent without leave for 3 days in January, and caught in a brothel by military police when he should have been preparing his boat for patrol. His superiors had already drafted the paperwork for his court-martial. He had one chance to save his career, find a significant target, sink it, and prove that his tactical brilliance outweighed his personal failures. The Baltic Sea in January 1945 was a graveyard waiting to happen. Soviet forces had broken through German lines in East Prussia, and the Wehrmacht's defensive positions were collapsing under sustained assault. German civilians who had lived in these territories for generations understood what Soviet occupation would mean. The Red Army's advance through Poland had been marked by systematic revenge for German atrocities committed during the invasion of the Soviet Union. Entire villages were destroyed, civilians killed or deported, homes burned. The pattern was clear enough that even Nazi propaganda, usually dismissed as exaggeration, appeared credible when describing Soviet brutality. Operation Hannibal began on January 21st, 1945, as the largest maritime evacuation in history. German naval forces commandeered every ship still afloat in Baltic ports: warships, cargo vessels, passenger liners, fishing boats, anything that could carry refugees westward to relative safety. Over the next 4 months, more than 1 million people would be evacuated by sea, far exceeding the scale of Dunkirk 5 years earlier. But the operation came too late for hundreds of thousands who had already fled overland through the winter, died of exposure on frozen roads, or been overtaken by Soviet forces. The port of Gotenhafen, known today as Gdynia, in Poland, became a desperate bottleneck. Refugees arrived by the thousands daily, some having walked for weeks through snow and sub-zero temperatures, dragging children and whatever possessions they could carry. The port authorities tried to maintain order, issuing tickets and checking documentation, but as word spread that ships were departing, the system collapsed under the pressure of sheer desperation. People abandoned horses that had pulled their carts, left dogs that had followed them from home, crowded onto docks designed for orderly commercial traffic. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been tied to a dock in Gotenhafen since 1940, serving as floating barracks for the 2nd Submarine Training Division. Originally built in 1937 as a cruise liner for Hitler's Strength Through Joy program, designed to provide subsidized vacations for German workers as propaganda demonstrating Nazi social benefits, the ship measured 684 feet long and could comfortably accommodate 1,900 passengers. By January 1945, it hadn't moved under its own power in years, its engines barely maintained, its crew a mixture of naval personnel and civilian merchant sailors who lacked combat experience or emergency training. 4 captains shared authority over the Wilhelm Gustloff when it was hastily pressed into evacuation service. Captain Friedrich Petersen held overall command as senior merchant navy officer. Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn commanded the submarine trainees being evacuated. Captain Kohler led the anti-aircraft gun crews recently installed on deck, and Captain Weller supervised the merchant navy complement. This divided command structure, common in German naval practice but catastrophically poor in emergencies, would contribute directly to the disaster. Boarding began on January 29th, with official manifests recording roughly 6,000 people. Submarine trainees, wounded soldiers being transported to hospitals in Kiel, civilian refugees with proper documentation, and female naval auxiliaries from Gotenhafen. But the manifests stopped reflecting reality as embarkation continued. Desperate refugees rushed the gangways, some with tickets, many without, all convinced this might be their last chance to escape Soviet occupation. By the time Wilhelm Gustloff departed on January 30th at midday, somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 people were crammed into every available space. The exact number will never be known. Many boarded without being recorded. Children were packed into the drained swimming pool. Families squeezed into cabins designed for 2 or 3 passengers. Corridors became sleeping spaces. The ship's ventilation system, inadequate for normal passenger loads, failed completely under the strain. Below decks became oppressively hot despite the freezing January weather outside, prompting many refugees to remove their life jackets to sleep more comfortably, a decision that would kill them hours later. The captains argued about the route. Zahn, an experienced submariner who understood the threat from Soviet submarines operating in Baltic waters, wanted to sail close to shore in shallow water where submarines couldn't easily maneuver, maintaining complete blackout to avoid detection. Peterson overruled him, insisting the coastal waters were heavily mined and that sailing offshore in deeper water was safer. To avoid collisions with German minesweeper convoys reportedly operating in the area, Peterson ordered the ship's navigation lights turned on despite Zahn's furious objections. The decision made Wilhelm Gustloff visible for miles across the dark Baltic waters, twinkling like a Christmas tree, according to survivors. The minesweeper convoy mentioned in the warning message never appeared because the message itself remains mysterious. None of the radio operators aboard Wilhelm Gustloff or its escort torpedo boat Löwe claimed to have received it. Whether it was a misunderstanding, a false report, or something more sinister was never determined. The ship departed Gotenhafen with minimal escort. A second torpedo boat and a minesweeper that were supposed to accompany the convoy never arrived due to mechanical problems. Only the torpedo boat Löwe sailed alongside Wilhelm Gustloff, and its defensive capabilities were severely compromised by the January cold. The submarine detection sonar had frozen solid, rendering it useless. The anti-aircraft guns had iced over and couldn't traverse. If the convoy encountered enemy action, it would be essentially defenseless. Wilhelm Gustloff steamed westward at 10 knots, slow enough that the elderly engines could maintain power, fast enough to reach Kiel within reasonable time if nothing went wrong. The sea was rough with choppy waves that made thousands of refugees violently seasick. Snow fell steadily, reducing visibility, but also potentially concealing the ship from enemy observation. For the first few hours, nothing went wrong. The ship followed its course, the escorts maintained position, and the refugees below decks tried to find comfortable positions in impossibly overcrowded spaces. 15 miles offshore, between Grossendorf and Leber on the Polish coast, Soviet submarine S-13 was hunting German targets. Captain Alexander Marinesko had orders to penetrate German-held waters, find ships supporting the evacuation or military operations, and sink them. His patrol had been unsuccessful so far, and he knew his career hung by a thread. The incident in the brothel wasn't his first disciplinary problem. He had a reputation for drinking, for insubordination, for showing contempt for regulations he considered bureaucratic interference with combat operations. His superiors tolerated this behavior only as long as he produced results. When Marinesko's lookouts spotted navigation lights moving across the dark water around 7 o'clock in the evening, he couldn't believe his luck. German ships were supposed to maintain blackout conditions. Finding one broadcasting its position seemed too easy. He studied the target through the periscope, a large passenger liner, clearly loaded based on how low it sat in the water, with escort vessels that appeared to be torpedo boats. The ship wasn't marked as a hospital vessel, which would have been painted white with red crosses visible even at night. It carried anti-aircraft guns on deck, making it a legitimate military target under international law. Marinesko didn't know whether the ship carried military personnel, war materials, civilians, or some combination. From his perspective, it didn't matter. Germany was the enemy. This was a German ship operating in wartime, and his orders were to sink German shipping. The fact that hitting this target would also salvage his career made the decision easier, not harder. He began maneuvering S-13 into attack position. The standard approach would be to attack from seaward, where the escort vessels patrolled and expected threats. Marinesko chose the opposite tactic, taking his submarine on a wide circle that brought him between the convoy and the shore, approaching from the direction where attacks were least expected. The maneuver was professionally competent, demonstrating the tactical skill that had earned him command despite his personal problems. He brought S-13 to within 1,000 meters of Wilhelm Gustloff, close enough that torpedo spread would be tight, far enough that he had time to dive if the escorts detected him. Before departure, his torpedo officer, André Piqueur, had painted slogans on the torpedoes. The first read, "For the motherland." The second said, "For the Soviet people." The third declared, "For Leningrad." These weren't official inscriptions, but personal messages, expressions of anger for what Germany had done to the Soviet Union during 3.5 years of war. Leningrad had endured 872 days of siege, during which more than 600,000 civilians starved to death. Soviet soldiers liberating territory previously occupied by Germany had found mass graves, destroyed villages, evidence of systematic atrocities. Marinesko and his crew weren't just following orders, they were seeking revenge. At 9:16 in the evening on January 30th, 1945, exactly 12 years after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Marinesko gave the order to fire. 4 torpedoes launched from S-13's tubes. The fourth, inscribed "For Stalin," hung up in its tube and never fired. The other 3 ran true, their wakes invisible in the dark, choppy water, striking Wilhelm Gustloff's port side within seconds of each other. The first torpedo hit the bow, near the crew quarters where off-duty sailors were sleeping. The explosion killed dozens instantly and triggered the ship's watertight doors to seal automatically, trapping crew members in compartments that were already flooding. The second torpedo struck amidships, just ahead of the midpoint, where thousands of refugees were packed into what had once been the ship's grand ballroom and dining areas. The blast killed hundreds directly and started fires that spread rapidly through wooden furnishings and personal belongings. The third torpedo hit the engine room, cutting off electrical power and killing the engineering crew who might have saved the ship by counter-flooding compartments to maintain stability. Wilhelm Gustloff immediately began listing to port. The refugees below decks, many of whom had removed their life jackets because of the oppressive heat, suddenly found themselves in darkness, broken only by fires spreading from the explosion sites. The corridors that had been uncomfortably crowded became death traps as thousands of people tried simultaneously to reach the upper decks. Stairwells tilted at crazy angles as the ship's list increased. Children were separated from parents in the darkness and chaos. People slipped on floors becoming steeper by the minute, falling into crowds of refugees pushing upward, creating human obstacles that blocked escape routes. On the upper decks, the crew tried to launch lifeboats, but most of the equipment was frozen solid. The lifeboats that could be freed from their davits often launched improperly, capsizing as they hit the water or coming down only partially loaded because untrained crew members didn't know how to fill them efficiently. The temperature was well below freezing, with wind chill making it feel even colder. Ocean spray froze on contact with metal surfaces, creating sheets of ice that made movement treacherous. Refugees who reached the boat deck found themselves facing a choice between staying aboard a sinking ship or jumping into water cold enough to kill them in minutes. The Baltic Sea in January was approximately 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough that survival time was measured in minutes, not hours. People who entered the water without life jackets sank immediately, pulled down by heavy winter clothing that absorbed water and became dead weight. Those with life jackets lasted longer but faced death from hypothermia as their core body temperature dropped below sustainable levels. The human body's response to sudden immersion in freezing water, called cold shock response, caused involuntary gasping that often resulted in drowning as people inhaled water instead of air. Those who survived cold shock faced a second danger: swimming failure, as muscles cooled and stopped responding to signals from the brain. Witnesses on the escort vessels reported seeing people jumping from Wilhelm Gustloff's decks as the ship's list increased beyond 45 degrees. Some jumped because they saw no other option, others were pushed by crowds pressing from behind, and some were blown overboard by secondary explosions as the fires reached stored ammunition. Many children were thrown into the water by parents hoping someone would rescue them, a desperate calculation that the child might survive even if the parent didn't. Almost none of these children survived. Captain Peterson, the senior commander, was on the bridge when the torpedoes hit. He knew immediately that the ship was doomed. The extent of flooding, the loss of power, the rapid list to port, all indicated catastrophic damage beyond any possibility of control. His priority shifted from saving the ship to saving as many people as possible. He ordered distress signals transmitted, flares launched, lifeboats prepared for evacuation. But the communications equipment was damaged, the flares were mostly frozen, and the lifeboats were inaccessible or unusable. His orders couldn't be executed because the ship's systems had been inadequately maintained and the crew lacked training for this type of emergency. Lieutenant Commander Zahn, who had argued against the navigation lights, found himself vindicated in the worst possible way. His submarine training told him exactly what had happened and what would happen next. He knew the ship would sink within an hour, that most people below decks were already trapped, that launching lifeboats in these conditions was nearly impossible. He also knew that standing on the bridge watching thousands die served no purpose. Zahn worked his way to the boat deck and helped with evacuation efforts until Wilhelm Gustloff's final plunge pulled him into the water, from which he was eventually rescued. 70 minutes after the torpedoes struck, Wilhelm Gustloff's stern rose into the air as the bow section settled onto the seafloor. Survivors in the water reported seeing the lights flicker on briefly, one final time, illuminating people clinging to railings on the nearly vertical deck before the ship made its final plunge. The suction as the ship went down pulled people underwater, and the debris field of wreckage, luggage, and bodies created a hazard for survivors trying to swim to safety. 9 vessels eventually responded to the distress calls and recovered survivors throughout the night. The torpedo boat Loa rescued 472 people. The minesweeper M387 pulled 98 from the water. The torpedo boat T36 saved 564. Together, the rescue vessels accounted for 1,252 confirmed survivors, though 13 died later from hypothermia or injuries. The surface of the Baltic was littered with bodies, most wearing the heavy winter coats that had kept them warm on deck but pulled them underwater once submerged. The last survivor pulled from the water was an infant, found wrapped in blankets between frozen corpses in a lifeboat that appeared completely empty of living people. When Petty Officer Werner Fick from patrol boat VP 1703 jumped into the lifeboat to check for survivors at 5:30 in the morning on January 31st, he found the baby still alive, protected by the blankets and the bodies of the frozen adults. Fick and his wife later adopted the child, who became known as the miracle survivor of Wilhelm Gustloff. The death toll will never be precisely known. Official passenger manifests recorded 6,000 people, but witnesses agree that thousands more boarded without being recorded. The most careful research, conducted by German archivist Heinz Schön, who survived the sinking and spent decades investigating it, estimates 9,343 deaths, including approximately 5,000 children. Other estimates range as high as 10,000. Whatever the exact number, Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking killed more people than the Titanic, Lusitania, and USS Indianapolis combined. Alexander Marinesko and S-13 escaped without being detected by the escort vessels. The frozen sonar on the torpedo boat Lover meant the escorts never knew where the submarine was or what direction it had fled. Marinesko surfaced several miles away, confirmed the sinking through his periscope, and continued his patrol. He would sink another German ship, the General von Steuben, 10 days later, killing approximately 3,000 more people before returning to base in February. But Marinesko's tactical success didn't translate into professional redemption. When he reported sinking Wilhelm Gustloff, his superiors were unimpressed. They didn't know how many people had died because Germany suppressed information about the disaster. They knew only that Marinesko had sunk a large transport ship, which was his job, but this didn't erase his disciplinary problems or make him suitable for continued command. Instead of receiving the title Hero of the Soviet Union, which would have been automatic for such a significant sinking under different circumstances, Marinesko received the Lesser Order of the Red Banner. He was downgraded to lieutenant, preventing him from commanding submarines, and dishonorably discharged from the Soviet Navy in October 1945. The Soviet government deemed him not suitable to be a hero because heroes were supposed to embody communist ideals, and Marinesko's drinking and insubordination made him politically inconvenient despite his tactical effectiveness. He worked various civilian jobs after the war, continued having problems with authority, and eventually served 3 years in a Siberian labor camp for what Soviet authorities called economic crimes. He was reinstated to his rank of Captain Third Class in 1960 and granted a full pension in 1963, dying 3 weeks after his official rehabilitation ceremony from cancer at age 50. 27 years after his death, in 1990, Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev posthumously awarded Marinesko the title Hero of the Soviet Union. By then, the Soviet Union had less than 2 years left to exist, and the rehabilitation of previously inconvenient heroes fit Gorbachev's glasnost policy of reassessing Soviet history honestly. But the posthumous honor couldn't resolve the central question: was Marinesko a hero for sinking an enemy ship, or was he responsible for the worst maritime disaster in history? The legal question has a clear answer. Wilhelm Gustloff was a legitimate military target under international law. The ship wasn't marked as a hospital vessel, despite having served in that capacity earlier in the war. It carried approximately 1,000 German naval personnel being evacuated to continue training or fight elsewhere. It had anti-aircraft guns mounted on deck, making it an armed military transport. Marinesko had no way of knowing how many civilians were aboard, and international law didn't require him to verify the exact composition of passengers before attacking a military target. The moral question is far less clear. 9,000 deaths cannot be dismissed as mere statistics, especially when approximately half the victims were children. The refugees aboard Wilhelm Gustloff weren't soldiers, weren't producing weapons, weren't making direct contributions to Germany's war effort. They were civilians fleeing Soviet occupation, and their decision to flee was based on well-founded fears of what that occupation would mean. Soviet forces advancing through German-held territory had committed systematic atrocities, a pattern of revenge for German atrocities committed during the invasion of the Soviet Union. But those German atrocities were real and staggering in scale. The siege of Leningrad, which prompted one of the slogans painted on Marinesko's torpedoes, killed more than 600,000 civilians through systematic starvation, a number that dwarfs Wilhelm Gustloff's death toll by a factor of 60. German forces deliberately cut off all food supplies to the city for 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944. Civilians ate wallpaper paste, leather, and eventually each other in desperate attempts to survive the winter. The dead were too numerous to bury properly, their bodies stacked like cordwood in the frozen streets until spring thaws allowed mass graves to be dug. German forces murdered an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens during the war, most of them civilians, through a combination of military operations, deliberate starvation, execution of prisoners, and systematic extermination campaigns. The Hunger Plan, Germany's strategy for feeding its armies by starving Soviet civilians, was explicit genocide designed to kill 30 million people to free up food resources. The plan was partially executed and partially failed, but the intent was clear and the death toll massive. The refugees fleeing Soviet occupation in January 1945 were fleeing the consequences of what their government had done to Soviet territory from 1941 to 1944. This context doesn't make the deaths of 5,000 children morally acceptable. Children don't choose their governments or their wars. But it explains why Marinesko and his crew painted revenge slogans on torpedoes, why Soviet authorities viewed German civilian casualties with indifference, why decades passed before anyone in Russia questioned whether sinking Wilhelm Gustloff was something to celebrate. From the Soviet perspective, German suffering in 1945 was a fraction of what Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union, and the fact that civilians were dying reflected Germany's decision to fight to the last possible moment rather than surrender when the war was clearly lost. The German government suppressed information about Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking during the final months of the war. Publishing details about maritime disasters or refugee casualties was considered harmful to morale and military security. After Germany's surrender, discussing the sinking was complicated by the political division of Germany into East and West. East Germany, under Soviet occupation and communist government, had no interest in publicizing Soviet responsibility for civilian deaths. West Germany focused on rebuilding and moving forward rather than dwelling on wartime losses. The result was that one of history's greatest maritime disasters remained largely unknown for decades. When information about the sinking finally became public, reactions divided along predictable lines. Some viewed it as a war crime, arguing that attacking a ship full of refugees violated moral standards even if it didn't violate legal standards. Others defended Marinesko, pointing out that he had no way of knowing the ship's passenger composition and that Germany's decision to use civilian ships for military evacuations had created the situation. Still others acknowledged the tragedy while recognizing that assigning blame in the final months of a war that killed 60 million people was complicated at best. The 4 captains who shared command of Wilhelm Gustloff survived the sinking. Zahn was called before a German naval board to answer for the disaster, but the board never reached conclusions because Nazi Germany collapsed before the investigation could be completed. No blame was officially assigned for the overcrowding, the navigation lights, or the inadequate life-saving equipment. Zahn spent the rest of his life as a salesman, never speaking publicly about the night he watched thousands die. Captain Peterson never went to sea again, living quietly until his death decades later. For weeks after January 30th, frozen bodies washed up on Baltic beaches. Local populations buried them in mass graves, usually without identification, because the bodies were too damaged by cold and water for recognition. Some were children still wearing life jackets that had kept them afloat but couldn't keep them warm. Others were adults who had survived the initial sinking but succumbed to hypothermia after hours in the freezing water. The graves are unmarked today, forgotten casualties of a war that had already consumed millions before Wilhelm Gustloff even sailed. The memorial landscape for Wilhelm Gustloff reflects the complicated politics of remembering maritime disasters during wartime. No major monument marks the sinking at sea or on shore. Small memorials exist in Germany, maintained by survivor groups and historical societies, but these attract minimal public attention compared to memorials for military battles or concentration camp victims. The moral ambiguity of how to remember 9,000 deaths when both perpetrator and victims were part of a larger horror makes commemoration difficult. The ship itself lies in approximately 140 feet of water off the Polish coast, its position known and marked as a grave site. Polish authorities prohibit diving on the wreck without special permission, treating it as a war grave containing the remains of thousands who were never recovered. Pieces of the ship occasionally wash ashore during storms, physical reminders of the disaster corroded by 75 years of salt water. The question Wilhelm Gustloff poses isn't whether Marinesko violated international law, which he clearly didn't. The question is whether international law adequately addresses moral complexity when 9,000 civilians die as collateral damage to a legitimate military operation. The answer probably is that law and morality operate on different levels, that legal justification doesn't necessarily equal moral justification, and that wars create situations where every choice is terrible and commanders must choose the least terrible option available. Marinesko faced a simple tactical situation: enemy ship, valid target, opportunity to strike. From his perspective, the ship could have been carrying troops, weapons, supplies, anything that contributed to prolonging a war that was killing Soviet soldiers daily. Sinking it was his duty. The fact that it was instead carrying mostly refugees and children was tragic, but changing the outcome would have required him to verify passenger composition before attacking, which was impossible, or to avoid attacking ships that might contain civilians, which would have made him ineffective as a submarine commander. The refugees boarding Wilhelm Gustloff faced an equally simple situation: stay and face Soviet occupation with all its risks, or flee westward and face maritime dangers. Most chose to flee because Soviet occupation seemed more dangerous than winter sailing in a war zone. They were probably right to flee, given what happened to many Germans who remained in Soviet-occupied territory, but their choice put them aboard a legitimate military target being hunted by submarines with orders to sink German shipping. These parallel simplicities created a catastrophic collision in which 9,000 people died, not because anyone intended to kill specifically them, but because the structure of war creates situations where killing civilians becomes tactically rational and legally permissible while remaining morally devastating. Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking wasn't an aberration or a war crime. It was a logical consequence of total war, where every resource is militarized and every action is justified by military necessity. The victims weren't killed by Marinesko's decision to fire torpedoes, but by Germany's decision to fight to collapse rather than surrender when defeat was inevitable. Had Germany surrendered even weeks earlier, Wilhelm Gustloff would never have sailed. Those refugees would have remained home or reached safety by other routes, and 5,000 children would have grown up to live normal lives. The moral responsibility for those deaths, extends backward through every decision that prolonged the war unnecessarily, and forward through every government that calculated the cost of surrender would exceed the cost of continued fighting. This doesn't absolve Marinesko of killing 9,000 people. He pulled the trigger, or rather gave the order that launched the torpedoes that killed them. But focusing on his individual responsibility obscures the larger truth that Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking was predictable, preventable, and ultimately the result of systemic failures rather than individual malice. Blame can be distributed across German naval authorities who overcrowded the ship, German military leadership that continued fighting when defeat was certain, Soviet strategic doctrine that prioritized vengeance over civilian protection, and the general brutalization of warfare that made 9,000 deaths seem like just another statistic in a war that killed 60 million. Today, Wilhelm Gustloff appears occasionally in lists of maritime disasters, usually with an asterisk noting it occurred during wartime, and victim counts are uncertain. It rarely receives the attention given to Titanic, Lusitania, or other peacetime disasters, partly because wartime casualty figures are inherently ambiguous, and partly because assigning blame for wartime losses raises uncomfortable questions about how we evaluate military necessity versus human cost. The handful of survivors still living as of 2020 are now in their late 70s or 80s, the last generation with living memory of the disaster. Most chose not to speak publicly about what they experienced, finding that describing the night Wilhelm Gustloff sank required explaining context that listeners either didn't understand or didn't want to hear. How do you make someone understand what it meant to watch thousands of children drown while you survived? How do you explain surviving when your family didn't? How do you assign moral responsibility for a disaster that was simultaneously criminal in its human cost and legal in its military justification? The psychological trauma of surviving Wilhelm Gustloff was compounded by the silence that surrounded it. Unlike survivors of Titanic or other peacetime disasters who received public sympathy and recognition, Wilhelm Gustloff survivors faced decades of official silence from both East and West German governments. Their story didn't fit convenient narratives about the war, forcing them to process their trauma privately without the collective acknowledgement that helps communities heal from disaster. These questions have no good answers, which is perhaps why Wilhelm Gustloff remains relatively unknown, despite killing more people than any other single ship sinking in maritime history. The story forces confrontation with moral complexity that most people prefer to avoid. The recognition that terrible things can be simultaneously criminal and legal, that individual decisions create consequences far beyond what anyone intended, and that war creates situations where every choice is terrible and someone must choose anyway. Alexander Marinesko died believing he had done his duty. The Soviet government that dishonored him during his life posthumously honored him decades after his death. The refugees who died in the Baltic Sea on January 30th, 1945, are remembered primarily by surviving family members, if at all. And the question of whether Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking was a legitimate military operation, a war crime, or something else entirely remains disputed, probably forever. The only certainty is that 9,000 people went into the freezing Baltic Sea that night, and almost none of them came back out alive. The only certainty is that 9,000 people went into the freezing Baltic Sea that night, and almost none of them came back out alive.